Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third Pollinators Week webinar with Dr. Terry Kane. My name is Laura Venner, and I'm the Global and Public Health Officer for SAVMA. Before we get started, please make sure to stay muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat, and my elect, Ashley Miller, and I will field the questions during and after the webinar. Just a few reminders before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and posted to our SAVMA YouTube channel. We will be sharing the links with the SAVMA delegates, so be on the lookout in the coming week with those links. Also, don't forget to take a screenshot of yourself in the webinar and tag SAVMA social media pages for a chance to win a $25 Amazon gift card. So let's get started. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Terry Kane. Dr. Terry Ryan Kane entered veterinary school at the University of Illinois with a master's degree in ecology from UI Chicago. She took beekeeping from the UI Extension Service during vet school as part of an animal behavior project. As a pilot, she was interested in their navigation and communication behavior, the quack and the waggle dance. After graduation, she owned and operated Michigan's first feline-only practice for 23 years. She was an AVMA-AAAS Congressional Science and Technology Policy Fellow from 2010 to 2011 in the U.S. Senate, working on antimicrobial resistance, emerging diseases, and food safety and security. Returning home to Ann Arbor, Michigan, she started up beekeeping again. With a concomitant knowledge of how critical pollinators are to food safety and what new FDA regulations meant to beekeepers, she started 2AB Vet, a veterinary practice serving our honey beekeepers and our pollinators. She currently serves as the secretary on the Honey Bee Vet Consortium, is a member of the AVMA's Committee on Environmental Issues, and is co-editor of a new book coming out later this year called Honey Bee Medicine. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kane. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. So tonight, I'm going to talk about all of this from a One Health perspective, and everything I talk about impacts our bee herd. So it also applies to other species, but keep in mind that this impacts bees. So I'm going to give a plug out to our Honey Bee Veterinary Consortium that Dr. Kyle mentioned to you on Monday. And this book is the first North American book that will be coming out about honeybee medicine for veterinarians. So hopefully by the end of the year. And honeybees are now considered livestock, as you know, because we consume hive products, as well as use them in many ways. So Dr. Kyle mentioned that we consume a lot of honey in the United States. We consume more than we make, and so we have imported honey. I think COVID is going to change things for the honey consumer. And our beekeepers will probably keep more of our honey in the States, and prices may go up, I don't know. But honeybee products are also found in all kinds of products: pollen, beeswax, candles, cosmetics, and who hasn't heard of Burt's Bees since Clorox bought that? Well, for any of you that are interested in going into bee medicine, I want you to be cognizant that there is a big movement in American apitherapy. And so if you go to bee meetings, you will find that a lot of products are sold, and homeopathy pushes a lot of products. There has never been a more popular time for bees right now. Some people believe that the sting helps with inflammation, and I can say that a few times I get stung, my fingers do feel a little better. But you'll see in the bottom corner, I had never seen apitherapy used for aerosol before. So just be cognizant that this is an animal and the only insect that we consume their products. We put it on our skin, we ingest it, we get stung by it, and we use a lot of their insect products. In fact, some of you may have seen this in different areas of the press. This is from Science Times. But the reason that we're involved in this is not just antimicrobials, but this is one of the most important animals that veterinarians can deal with. We actually can survive without pigs and goats and chickens. We can actually live without them, but we cannot live without our bees. So it's a very important animal to take care of. Any of you guess what this is? Well, from Dr. Kyle's lecture on Monday, you know that this is the inside of a hive.
I think we're seeing a black screen.
That's right, that's the inside of a hive.
There you go.
There is nothing to see. So these animals don't rely on vision inside. They rely on a multitude of pheromones and glands. And as mentioned, I got into bees because I was fascinated. So Dr. Kyle wasn't able to show this. She mentioned it to you, but I'm going to show you the waggle dance. So here's a little bee. She came back, this is a worker bee, came back into the hive, and she's telling her sisters where the food is. She waggle, 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 waggles. And now we know that 1 second of waggle is equal to 750 meters. She does a circle dance. And that tells her sisters the direction of the food source from the hive and the value of that food resource. There is no other animal that can fly miles away, that's 10 millimeters in size, that comes back and communicates to thousands in the hive where to go to get the food. It's amazing to me. Bees have been around for 100 million years, and we just got GPS in 1994. So this to me was fascinating. So I want to show you. So Carl von Frisch, who did the original work on this and won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, who was the first Nobel Prize awarded for animal behavior, he had graduate students, but we had computers. So Margaret Kuvian at Virginia Tech did data analytics on the waggle dance. And this is common sense. You can see in March when the flowers start to bloom, the bees stay pretty much at home. But in August, what beekeepers call the dearth period, when the flowers are off the rose, the bloom is off the rose, the bees have to travel further and further to gather nectar and pollen. They routinely go 6,000 meters, which is almost 4 miles. This is my house. They're in the middle. I'm in Ann Arbor. And when you go on a hive call, if you do, you need to be cognizant the time of the year, not just the weather and the temperature, but what's around. So around my hive, if I go out 6 kilometers, I've got rooftop, I've got beautiful wildflower gardens, golf courses with less pesticides, and I've got farm area. So be cognizant of the time of the year and how far your bees are traveling. So I'm going to be talking about One Health Connect tonight. These are all of the ones that I think veterinary medicine is involved in, but I'm only going to talk about 3 of them, and I'm going to try and spend about 20 minutes on each. One thing in veterinary medicine, we talk a lot about One Health, but I feel like the environment gets last place, ignored. We talk about human and animal health, but we don't talk enough about environmental health. So I'm going to start with that. I also want to remind you veterinarians that One Health is not a new concept. And I hope you haven't seen Dr. Schwabe's book before, that you go to your library and look at it, because it's amazing that in 1964, when the first edition came out, that he coined the term One Medicine, which in 2007 the AVMA, Dr. Marr at OSU or Iowa, I think he changed the term to One Health. But take a minute just to read this incredible concluding remark. They're so apropos for what's going on today. I'll give you a minute to read that. Pretty timely. So we are the only health professionals that encompass all three of these three-legged stool, we call it, the environment, human, and animal health. So we've all seen these One Health, this is CDC, and this is OIE. And you can see there's something missing on these. So I went, and I'm on a campaign now to add bees. You can see on the, I can't use my pointer here, but there's a little bee on the bottom right on the Michigan State logo. CVM doesn't even mention the environment, it's protecting human and animal health. So I added a bee above the chicken's head right there. So I'm asking all the veterinary students at all of your schools, if you have One Health logos, please ask the artist to add a bee. In the Michigan State poster there, they had flowers and they had birds and snakes and everything, but they didn't have a bee. So I hope they'll add that. And this is a logo I really like because environment is mentioned. And there's a number of vet schools now that have global health departments or global health institutes. And I would like to see more veterinarians learn about the environmental aspect of this. Our professions collaborate with med schools, nursing schools, science departments, agriculture schools, engineering schools now. The concept not new, but with the convergence and global climate change, there's new challenges that have come up that absolutely in the environment is a big part of that. We veterinarians know there are 1,400 recognized diseases and 60% of those are zoonotic and cross lines. And now with this COVID epidemic, veterinarians are getting a lot more attention now. So I'm going to start with climate change, because this is something that I wasn't taught in school. I don't know if you are, but it should be part of your One Health curriculum. Weather is not climate change. There's been some confusion about that. Greenhouse gases that are CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide, there are natural occurring too, but they are invisible to visible light, and so we don't see them. And they let sunlight through, warming the earth. And these greenhouse gases act as a blanket over the earth, trapping the heat so it can't escape back out into space. And so the human component of burning fossil fuels, et cetera, has added to natural emissions. These extra gases are trapping the heat, adding to temperature increases, thus global warming. And it's affecting not just the environment, it's affecting plant and animal biodiversity, and it's actually impacting disease management. These are data that's taken from ice cores that's been done on the poles. They've been able to go back 800,000 years to look at carbon bubbles in these ice. And you see that it's pretty much stayed same. These dips and troughs are glaciations. We've had 12 major glaciations. We've had volcanoes and all that. But given the peaks and troughs with all of that, we've never had a rise like we do now. In fact, people were hoping that with COVID, we would see a dip, but we're not. We're seeing, this graph just shows you from the Industrial Revolution. And so it stayed pretty stable until after World War II, when industry really took off, and fossil fuels and manufacturing and all of that. So One thing that's very interesting is since the 1988, the United Nations convened the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPC. It's a United Nations body, and it was formed in the late 80s to provide governments at all levels with scientific information from scientists over the world that was peer-reviewed so that logical climate change policies could be developed, and that led to the Paris Accords. There's a number of these pamphlets put out. They've looked at soil, they've looked at water. The most recent one that got a lot of attention last year was this one on global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And why is that so important? Well, 195 nations got together and agreed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And this report talks about what that mitigation means for the difference between 1.5. And I encourage you to read these reports. They're lengthy, but if you're interested in them, they're available online. There's no doubt anymore that humans have contributed to global warming. It's not true that just natural causes can lead to this. Their last episode that the Earth was this warm probably was back 15 million years ago when the seas were 11 feet higher, and that's when, well, it was before dinosaurs, but we don't have human records of that. But the upshot is that this climate change is causing the weather extremes that we're seeing. So whether it's flooding or fires, mudslides, tornadoes, glacier melting, we should all be cognizant of the impact that this is having on our animals, or on One Health, I should say. So I'm not going to show you any pictures of starving polar bears or anything like that. I just wanted you to be aware that biodiversity is decreasing on the planet. In the past century, 500 species of land-living vertebrates have disappeared. And this is a milestone that scientists think under natural circumstances would have taken thousands of years. This is the science paper below was just published. And that adds about 500 more vertebrate species that have been lost in the last 2 decades, like this rhino that's in the picture. Researchers found that about 2% or more of the almost 30,000 terrestrial species could be critically endangered in your lifetime. That is out of business. So here's just a schematic. This is from the World Economic Forum. This shows that 83% population decline in our freshwater species, 31% of our known insects. Anybody can look this up and for themselves. So the point with that was with the warming, like we had last summer in Michigan, anyway, at Lake Erie, we had one of the largest harmful algal blooms we'd ever had. And you know from veterinary medicine treating dogs that have gotten into the harmful algal blooms and getting cyanoria. Next slide. This is a slide from last fall, October, and October was unusually hot in that part of the country. It was so hot that some of the fruit growers said that the fruit melted on the trees. Next slide. So we're even seeing this in marine areas. There's Antarctica that was 65 degrees in February, which was unheard of. A marine heat wave is impacting the food supply for our saltwater species. Next slide. So we've surpassed that 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade already in many parts of the world, even the United States. This is a picture from Alaska last summer where the permafrost is melting due to the heat. This Antarctica, I should say, the Arctic was over 100 degrees on the Siberian side. And this lower left picture that says Thursday, the 25th of June, is because this came from Europe last night, early this morning, and it shows 38 degrees almost around, circling the Arctic, and that's 100 degrees. Never seen that before. Next slide. So these are the floods in the Midwest from last summer. These are Iowa and Nebraska. That one on the right is 5 feet of sand that was deposited on farmland from the Missouri River flooding. Next slide. So this kind of just summarizes that we've gone over the 400 mark for carbon. Global temperature has gone up 1.9, and sea ice is melting. We don't know, nobody's predicting, certainly not accurately, what sea level rise is going to be. Next slide. So how does that affect agriculture? I think, yeah. There's a website on the bottom that was made in Ohio about with the weather extremes. I would encourage you to watch this video. We don't have time now, but there's a lot of work being done on all of this, and this video is really excellent. Next slide. So how does this impact the farms? It's not just global warming, it's not just trade negotiations and such, it's the weather extremes that have led to a plethora of farm bankruptcies that we've never seen before. Next slide. Good things are happening though. And this is kind of where I left off, I guess. There are 25 states, both red and blue, makes no difference. 25 governors have agreed, signed on to the Paris Accords to follow the recommendations of the Global Climate Change panel. And you can go to your website of your state and see what their website, the ones that are in the Alliance have climate change websites. Go to the next slide. Here's an example. This is Nevada. And you can see at the top left, it says US Climate Alliance. And these websites delineate what action your state is going to be taking. Now, there are a lot of veterinarians actually that are involved in agriculture, climate change stuff. I've talked to some vets in Montana and Wyoming that are involved on committees, One Health committees. So check that out. Next slide. So I went and looked at states that are not in the Alliance to see what they were doing. And this, I picked Indiana because it's near me. And they have a really good website, not as complete as the Alliance states, but it has really good information for people. Next slide. So how does this all impact us? Well, agriculture is part of our wheelhouse. And so food security, water resources, soil content is going to be really important in the future, in your lifetimes. We're expecting almost 10 billion people on the planet, and World Health Organization has said that global agriculture might have to increase 30 to 70% depending on what area of the world that you're in. Again, global climate change is not just affecting the environment, but it's plant and animal biodiversity and diseases, as we see. So public health, food safety, and food security, it's our job. Next slide. So we all need food for energy. And I put this slide here because I think too often we consider ourselves the top predator or the alpha species here. Certainly we have every means to kill everything, but I'd like us to think more holistically as we're part of a food web, that we are interdependent on plants and animals and the environment for our health. I would say that we're more like pigs and anchovies in terms of that. We're omnivores. We eat plants and animals. Some people blame livestock for part of global warming. but they're not a major contributor. It's fossil fuels that are a major contributor. Next slide. So we need these pollinators. As Dr. Kyle said Monday, there are 4,000 species of native bees. We have 46 species of bumblebees and thousands of species of wasps, moths, flies, ants, beetles, butterflies, birds, and bats. These pollinators are actually the biosensor animals of our environmental health right now. And certainly our health is linked to theirs. Bees get sick just like any other animal. And we veterinarians that have a new role in honeybee health, now that they're considered livestock, like other food producing animals, we need to learn about them. We need to learn about the stressors about them. We need to help people not be afraid and not squash these bugs. Well, maybe cockroaches, but pollinators, there's almost 250,000 pollinators, and we need all of them. So I want you to think about how we can all participate, whether you keep bees or not. Next slide. And there is a dearth of insects right now. We've probably lost almost 40 to 50% of our insects. That's globally. So when we cut out, I was telling a story about when I drove to the AVMA in Indiana from Ann Arbor to Indianapolis. It was about 300 miles. And I got there on the interstate and noticed that I only had 8 bugs on my windshield. This is late July, August. I mean, when I was a kid, every time you stop at a gas station, you had to scrape your grill and window off. So I decided to take back roads coming home, and I only counted 12 insects. So I took my plane up. I went 2,000 feet, 4, 6, 8,000 feet counting insects, and I was shocked. Decades ago, when I would land, I would have to take an hour to clean my leading edge of my wings off. It took a long time to scrub the insects off. Now it's hardly anything. Next slide. And here are some of the reasons: mostly agriculture, pesticides, habitat loss, etc. Next slide. And I think a lot of people forget that this is bird food. So without insects, there's no birds, and there has been a loss of birds. Next slide. This is from Cornell Lab of Ornithology that says, if you were alive in 1970, 25% of the birds have disappeared in your lifetime. They're doing a lot of data gathering on that. Next slide. This is just statistics to show you beyond 2030 and 2050, how are we gonna share resources, feed people, deal with climate change? I don't have answers. I just know that future generations are going to be dealing with all this, and I hope that we start trying to mitigate things now. Next slide. So these are just some of the crops of foods that bees and other pollinators pollinate for us. It's all I could fit on the slide. There's over 100 of them. And as Dr. Kyle mentioned Monday, wind pollinated plants who don't have flowers that pollinators don't collect nectar and honey from because they're wind pollinated, it's just wheat and soybeans and corn. But if you want coffee, blueberries, chocolate, all of the things that we rely on for the gamut of nutrients that we enjoy, then we need to protect our pollinators. Next slide. So what do these animals have in common? So it's not just the fruit and vegetables that we eat. They also pollinate forage crops. So if we want milk and eggs and meat from animals that eat alfalfa and clover, then we need to protect our pollinators. So the point is, pollinator loss is actually a threat to global food security. So we've talked about honey. In human history, honey was very important, and the bees revolved around honey and all the products that we use. But now pollination is actually the driver for commercial beekeepers. Next slide. And Dr. Kyle mentioned native bees. These are just some of them. There's a nice chart and book. Bees, mason bees, carpenter bees. I mention these because now these bees are part of our pollination smorgasbord. Next slide. So honeybees are our #1 managed pollinator because we can crate them up, put in a box, move them around. But native bees, by and large, are ground dwellers. They live in little burrows, solitary. They don't live in big groups. They don't store honey and pollen except what they need for their own reproduction. And so when we go through agriculture fields and spray pesticides on the ground, we are harming our native bees as well. Next slide. And Dr. Kyle mentioned these losses, which are really unsustainable. Imagine if we had sheep or cattle or such losses this high. 43% of all the cattle died or something. There'd be a lot of attention paid to that. Next slide. So you can go to Bee Informed Partnership and look at your state. This is a slide from 2008 and 18. The 2018-19 is more of an interactive website, so I couldn't really show it, but you can go to your state on their website and find out what the statistics are in your own state. I do recommend that you go and look at Bee Informed Partnership. Next slide. This is an interesting slide. I'll just explain it very quickly. It's the first national study of mapping wild bees. And researchers found that crops that are most dependent on pollinators, like pumpkins, watermelons, peaches, plums, apples, and blueberries, crops that are most likely to run into trouble in the future. And one of the reasons is with global climate change, we're finding that there's a disconnect between when the insects emerge and when the flowers emerge. And so in some areas, some of the flowers come too soon. In some areas, the flowers are coming too late. But there used to be, and there still is in most places, a really good synchrony. Now remember, bees have evolved, they've co-evolved with plants so that emergence coincides, so that spring when the flowers bloom is when the bees are at their highest reproduction. So we're finding with climate change, there's a disconnect there. Next slide. And of course, you know something is pollinated when it does things to attract the pollinators. So whether it's the fluorescence or the smell or the honey or such, there's a variety of flowers that have co-evolved with the bees, such that some of our bees, native bees, have mouth parts like butterflies do that are anatomically synced with a particular flower. Honeybees are nice because they'll go to any flower. Next slide. And Dr. Kyle mentioned about pollination. I wanted to stress that the pollen is the male gametes and it gets deposited on the female stigma, like she explained on Monday. Next slide. And so pollination is when a bee goes to a flower. Next slide, or no, this should come up, just hit it, there we go. There we go. So if any of you ever had any of those beanbag chairs and it split open and all those little styrofoam balls come out and stick to you, that's how the gametes stick to the bees. So it's an electrical charge. And as Dr. Kyle explained, they have specialized antenna and special pollen baskets where they are able to store this and fly. And they actually almost have enough pollen on their bodies that equals their body weight. So imagine this little 10, 11 millimeter animal flying 3 miles, collecting all this, storing it in her corbicula, in her pollen baskets, flying back and then finding her own hive. They're remarkable. Next slide. So one of the way producers estimate how efficient pollination is by looking at the seeds. So press the slide, it should come up. There we go. So I picked an apple to show you because that's really simple as opposed to a watermelon or a cantaloupe. You know your fruit has been efficiently pollinated by looking at the seed set. So in an apple, you cut it open and you see 5 stars, and each star should have 2 seeds. So if you ever cut open an apple and you see there's a shriveled up seed or there's not 2 in each one, you know that that wasn't efficiently pollinated. Next slide. Well, in the US, 900 million acres are in cultivation and agriculture. Next slide. And most of those are monocultures. So we've lost a lot of habitat. This is a wind pollinated, of course. Next slide. Dr. Kyle mentioned the almond pollination. So in a couple of weeks, every February, probably 90% of our entire bee herd is located in the Central Valley of California, pollinating over 1 million acres. And what happens is after the bloom is gone, that's a food desert to these animals. Next slide. The Central Valley of California is where we get 2/3 of our fruits and nuts and vegetables here in the United States. Central Valley is 500 miles long and about 60 miles wide. And this is a state where a drought has been common and water resources have been a problem. The diminishing Colorado River feeds this area, and so there is a depletion of groundwater here with all of the accompanying pollution that goes along with so much agriculture. Next slide. These are acres and acres and acres of cherry orchards in upstate Michigan. Next slide. Maine's blueberries. The point of all this is just the habitat loss and the huge monocultures. Next slide. So we take these managed pollinators and we rack them up into semi-trucks. We move them around the country. It's stressful on these animals, and we spread disease. Next slide. So let me put this in a herd health context. Yes, farmers cannot rely on native bees anymore or local pollinators to pollinate these vast croplands anymore. So they rent these big commercial companies to come in, and you have to use 2 hives per acre. And back 20 years ago, maybe it cost $10 to $20 a hive. And now prices, because we've lost commercial beekeepers and because of labor costs, fuel costs, trucking, and new regulations, we have less than 1/4 of what the commercial beekeepers we used to have. And therefore, this cost $150 to $250. That's why almond prices are so high. And good thing, since we won't be exporting as many almonds probably this year because of COVID, almond prices may go down for us. I don't know. This is just a map to show you that the bees go from California in February up to Washington for apples, across the north for canola, down for us to cherries, up apples, and around the country, around and around and around they go. They're starting to warehouse some of the bees now. That's another topic. Next slide. So there are good things happening though. Modern monoculture has fed the world for decades, but we didn't know about the unintended consequences. And ecological principles applied to agriculture, there's a whole new field of not brand new, but this last few years of agroecology and a return to polyculture and cover crops. And there's a lot more interest in sustainable agriculture now. Next slide. And these are some good things that are happening. Planting prairie flowers in between, strips of wildflowers. And we're trying to conserve. The Farm Bill conservation programs actually support critical habitat. So if you're in bee medicine, you'll need to know what's in the Farm Bill for the commercial beekeepers and the farmers to pay attention to, and to increase pollinator biodiversity so that we do bring back our native pollinators. Next slide. And so alternative pollinators are starting to be grown and managed and funded. And this is a book by Marla Spivak, who's at Minnesota. And I'll show you an example. Next slide. This is the first time, this is a man, apple orchard producer in upstate New York, who worked Cornell Extension. And this was the first time he was able to pollinate his entire apple crop using native bees. Now it's very labor intensive, but he was able to do it using integrated pest management, using cover crops. Again, it's certainly more labor intensive, but he was able to bring back his wild bees. Next slide. So unfortunately, these millions of acres of monoculture give rise to pestilence because this lack of biodiversity leads to a pest taking over. Think of the potato blight in Ireland. Potatoes came from Peru, where there's hundreds of species of potatoes, so they've never had a potato blight that took over. But in Ireland back then, they produced just a few kinds of potatoes and the blight wiped out, and led to starvation and migration of thousands and thousands of people. So despite these warnings of history and ecology, we still lack the genetic diversity, and thus the rise of insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, all of which impacts our pollinators. Agriculture accounts for 80% of all the pesticides that are used in the United States. We're now learning the impact of that, not just on our pollinators, but on human health, soil, and water. Next slide. So we're even finding these traces of pesticides in honey. This was a global study that was done looking at honey from around the world, and it's everywhere. It's not just us. Next slide. This is a study from Penn State. By the way, any of you in Pennsylvania, Penn State has an amazing program for teaching bees, working with pollinators. Their scientists are just wonderful. Next slide. I'm not going to get into the discussion over neonics versus whatever. None of it's good. I think neonics are really good for indoor plants. But when you go and buy plants, check your labels. So this is kind of an integration of what is new in agriculture. They're using integration of pollinators, not just honeybees, but trying to bring back those native pollinators. And the reason is because actually native bees are actually more efficient with certain crops that they've co-evolved with, and the integration of better management practices. Next slide. So all of this led to there being a pollinator health task force, not just to restore honeybee health colonies, but to help protect the monarchs, which you know we've lost half of those, and to restore land for pollinators. 7 million acres to be restored is a drop in the bucket, but hopefully this will increase. Now every state has a pollinator protection plan. So you can go to your state and look up what your state is doing to protect pollinators. Next slide. So this is just a summary of all the things that are impacting not just our honeybees, but our pollinators that you want to keep in your head when you're trying to establish that relationship with bee clients. So I'm going to go to the last One Health issue, which is how we got into this racket in the first place, is through the fact that antimicrobial resistance is a recognized global health epidemic now. And in the US alone, almost 3 million people acquire resistant infections. And last year, 36,000 people died, and many more impacted by complications. Everybody, 10 years ago, I don't think people knew what MERS was, or MRSA, I mean, and now high school has MRSA. Every athletic field deals with it. We got blamed for it. When I was serving in Congress, I would go to these meetings and they said, well, veterinarians are using all these antibiotics in food animals. That's the problem. And it was true that veterinarians, we did use a lot of antibiotics, more than the humans used. But let's go to the next slide, because I've got some data for you. This is the first slide I saw that said the misuse of antibiotics in humans and in farming is a major reason for increased antimicrobial resistance. And at the bottom, you'll see I looked up just to see what most recent data I could find on what humans were prescribing. And they were prescribing antibiotics for every ear infection and cold and stuff. And they've really cut back. Every doctor's office now has posters and information, and doctors don't dispense antibiotics willy-nilly anymore, nor do we. Next slide. People do not want this in their food supply anymore. We don't want it in our water supply. We don't want it in our soil. It's leading to the unintended consequences that we're seeing recently. Next slide. So this is just some data to show you. This was before the VFD rule went in, and we see that there were tons of antibiotics used. I calculated this out for you, added the food and water, and it came out to about 9,000 tons of antibiotics that were used in our food animals. Next slide. So of those 9,000 tons that were used in animals, the majority of that was in tetracyclines, and you'll see this list. Bees are not listed here. There's been no tracking of antibiotics in bees. And I know Dr. Kyle had a question on Monday about antibiotic use. We can address more of that later, but the majority of medically important antibiotics have been tetracyclines, penicillins, macrolides. Next slide. Well, here's just some data on tetracycline resistance. As you know from school, resistance is nothing new. In fact, it's ancient. It's been around forever. It's part of bacteria's evolution process. Permafrost samples from thousands of years ago have shown that this was a natural phenomenon. But the misuse of this particular antibiotic now has led to 38 acquired resistant genes. So I don't talk to people about codons or proteins and such, but I do talk to them about overuse of antibiotics in the absence of a diagnosis. Right now in human medicine, there's no difference between cycline or oxytet resistance. They're found all through the environment. All animals, humans, there's over 100 genera now that carry these resistant genes, such that tetracycline is no longer considered a drug of choice in human medicine. Next slide. So we did see, once that VFD rule went into effect, we did see a drop in antibiotic use. We do know that most producers anticipated this. The FDA gave producers a couple years to voluntarily comply. That was 13, 14, 15, and we saw an increase in antimicrobial cells. They were hoarding them. So the VFD rule came along, and we did see a decrease in 2017, but it upticked a little bit in 2017. I don't have statistics for 18. I took this from the pork board because I liked, most producers now on their websites have guidelines for responsible antibiotic use. I picked this one because it's the only one I found. If you look at 4, they talk about management practices described for responsible use of the products, that it's not just meat, but it's the products. And certainly with bees, there are so many products that are used besides honey that we do have to be mindful of what goes into these products. The AVMA guidelines are very similar, but I like this one. Next slide. So what can you do? I want to, on a happy note, I didn't want to bum you all out, but you can do a lot of things, even if you don't become a veterinarian. You can be an insect farmer. You can plant pollinator-friendly plants. There are so many websites you can go and look up for your area of the country, what attracts fireflies and birds, butterflies and such. I took my whole front yard and I took all the grass out and turned it over and composted it and planted all pollinator plants in my front yard. And within 48 hours, I had 8 species of new pollinators, besides my honeybees. I had so many, it was just wonderful. Next slide. So you can create a pollinator habitat. You can put some water out for the bees. That will attract native bees. You can put up a bee hotel. They come in all shapes and sizes. They're commercially available, or you can make them yourself by drilling holes in wood. As I said, native bees either live in brush piles or underground. Don't mow your dandelions and grow a variety. Don't plant annuals. There's no nutritional value for bees in annuals. Even though they're pretty, you want perennials that have not had pesticide treatment. Next slide. Because we don't want a landscape that's not friendly to our pollinators. And even on your own, you can make your yard or your own habitat friendly. Because we don't want this. In China, this is a picture. They were actually pollinating with feathers because they're in the same boat, well, worse boat actually. Their climate change problems are worse than ours. Walmart was the first company to apply for a patent for drone pollination. And this little one on the bottom is the newest one I found. It's called RoboBee. It was made by MIT. And now there are a couple of commercial companies that drone pollinate our crops. And they advertise that they're more efficient because if it rains, they can just go back out and repollinate again. And I haven't seen any data on seed sets to look what that looks like, but RoboBee is, you see the scale there with a penny. Next slide. And please don't use these anymore. These urban insecticides are actually huge sales. You walk into any Lowe's or Home Depot and you'll see thousands of bottles of Roundup and complete insect killer, bug be gone. These are terrible, terrible, terrible. So I meant to show you a poster that you can put in your practice to show your clients that you are aware of pollinators and what harms the bees. Next slide. So this is to emphasize that because we got involved in bee medicine through the VFD route, that's not what we are. We're not prescription writers. We have so much to offer. All the principles of herd health management that you use with all your other livestock apply to bees. So to establish a VCPR, we want to learn, that's what you're doing now, you're learning enough. We need to communicate. I mentioned that I went through this in the 80s when aquaculture was coming to the fore and the fisheries were pushing back against veterinarians. We learned that they were dumping all kinds of medicines in the water with the catfish farms and such. And they pushed back and said, well, what do veterinarians know about fish? You don't know anything about fish. That was true, we didn't. And within a couple of years, AquaVet started at the University of Pennsylvania. We did hands-on training. And within a couple of years, veterinarians educated themselves about fresh and salt water, such that now it's routine for veterinarians to be involved in fresh and salt water. And I predict that it's going to be routine at some point for us to be involved with the 3 types of beekeepers that were mentioned, the backyarders, the sideliners, and certainly the commercial beekeepers that use the bulk of the drugs that we're talking about. They need help with record keeping. Bricks are not records. Inspection services. In France, veterinarians are the apiarists. In this country, it's some states have one, some states have two, some states have four. None of them are veterinarians, and I think this is a place where veterinarians can get involved. We're the ones to diagnose, prescribe, treat. People need to learn about disease management, and certainly integrated pest management is a big one, and advice on pesticides. You can't, as you know with other animals, you can't keep using the same drug over and over and over. Nutrition is huge with bees. We're going to need to learn some plant botany, food safety with the hive products, and biosecurity. Beekeepers are used to switching out frames from one box to another, and I've seen very poor biosecurity on most bee yards. And we need to include them in our disaster planning. And I can't emphasize enough how many opportunities there are for veterinarians in research. Next slide. So I saw this slide and it says they're carrying on their legs the life of the planet, but actually we are. They're dependent on us at this time with all of the habitat destruction and the pesticides. Remember, these critters have been around through 12 glaciations. They were there when the dinosaurs. They've been through every volcanic eruption. They even got through the fires in Australia last summer and survived. But they cannot survive with the way things are going now. So there's never been a better time for veterinarians to get involved in honeybee and pollinator health. Next slide. So indeed, this is a One Health, and there's a bee on there. Next slide. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions you have, and I'm sorry about the disruption. I don't know what happened.
Well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation.
Wow.
We got a few messages in our chats coming in, but please feel free to drop some questions in the chat as well. The first question I got was, do honeybees have predators that are becoming more of a problem due to climate change or due to backyard pesticides?
I would say pesticides is a bigger problem. I know Monday somebody brought up the killer wasp thing. That's not a problem as of yet. The biggest problem for honeybees is a varroa mite pest. That's a whole lecture in and of itself. That's an introduced pest, and it's swept the globe. The only place there's not varroa supposedly is Australia, and they've been doing pretty good surveillance to keep that pest out. So that's the biggest killer. And varroa mite carries a bunch of viruses, and so those are the biggest killers. They don't really have any big pests. Birds eat them sometimes, but I think we're the biggest killers.
That's sad to hear, but hopefully we can do our part to save them too. Is there a list of bee veterinarians where we can find veterinarians who would be interested in having students shadow them? Do you know where we could find something like that?
I've had a couple of requests myself, I know, and it's not a practice that's busy enough to have somebody shadow me because I never know when I'm going to be seeing people or not. What I tell students to do, the best thing to do, if you want to learn about bees, first off, before you get into bee medicine, you need to learn about bees. You don't need to own a pig to be a swine vet. You don't need to own a horse to be an equine vet. But it does help to have contact with those animals before you go into that practice. It helps to have a hive, or at least to work with one. So join your local bee club. They'll let you follow them around. They love the help. I can't tell you how much people will appreciate help lifting those boxes. I do. One box full of honey weighs like 50 pounds, so it's hard. But that's a good place to go. Is your local bee clubs are the best place to get your first experience. Taking bee school, whether you take it in person or through extension, go to bee school. I kept bees, in the late 70s and 80s, and I went back to bee school because so much has changed. We didn't have varroa back in the 70s and 80s. There weren't the pests. You would just put your hive up and let them be, and then get the honey and up for the winter and all was good. But now with treating, inspecting, and looking for pests, and it's different. So bee school, bee clubs, and that. And then in terms of a list, the Honey Bee Veterinary Consortium has a list by state of practicing veterinarians. And I know my state of Michigan has a separate list of bee veterinarians. And there aren't enough. So Brittany and I would, all of us at the Honey Bee Veterinary Consortium would love to have any of you join us, come to meetings, network with us. We'll do whatever we can to help you learn all you can.
Absolutely. And we will be emailing you and Dr. Kyle for some information on that. And we'll be sharing that on our Facebook page, on our One Health discussion forum, so that if anyone's interested in attending the online webinars, then absolutely, we'll share that with students. So we had another interesting question. Do you think that the invention of these robo-bees or drone pollinators is going to deter people from trying to save and protect bees and other pollinators?
You know, it's like any advance. Now, you know, farmers are using GPS and drones to look at soil analysis and where the water is. There's no stopping technology. I think that drones are going to be helpful until we can get more people involved in mitigating some of the challenges there are. We need our food pollinated.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you believe genetics plays a role? It plays a big part in bee veterinarians' roles. Sorry, particularly concerning breeding, better genetic or hygienic behavior, more resistant queens, etc.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And that's why I mentioned the research. There's so much research going on breeding better stock, just like there was for all the other livestock. Hopefully they won't be harmed by some of this genetics, but yes, we're looking for bees that are more resistant to varroa. There are different subspecies, we call them races or subspecies of bees, like Russian bees have a reputation for being more varroa resistant. So they're looking at the genetics. We try to raise queens that are hardier, and but like with the other livestock, looking for more reproduction, faster reproduction, that's happening too. So that it used to be a queen who can live 3 to 5 years. We used to keep our queens for a long time, but now some of the more, I don't want to use the word aggressive, commercial keepers, they're replacing their queens every 6 months to get the maximum fertility out of their queens. So absolutely research. I would recommend any veterinarian students to hook up with the extension service. If you need a summer job, go to the bee labs and see people helping them.
Yeah, we've had some professors reach out to Ashley and I to connect students with that. So if you're interested in honeybee research, let us know and we can kind of help direct you to some opportunities as well. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kane. We really appreciate you chatting with us. This is a really great presentation, and I think we all
lost some people to technical difficulties, but
no, it's okay. And we will be posting this on our SAVMA YouTube channel, and we'll crop out the miss.
Oh, good.
And so it'll be up there, and so students, if you guys wanted to view it one more time or whatnot, it'll be up there. So thank you again so much. We really appreciate it.
And like Brittany said, any of you that are really interested in bee medicine, you can contact us. Any of us at the Honey Bee Veterinary Consortium are more than willing to help any of you, really. We need you.
That's good to know. We really appreciate that. Can you share your contact information, or would you be okay if we shared your contact information in the chat box?
Yeah, you can just go to a2bvet.com. That's my website. You can message me through there.
So what I just put in the chat is Dr. Kane's website, and you can reach out to her through that. All right, thank you guys so much. I'm going to end this recording.